Truth is making a comeback. America's Top Stories with Lisa K. Donner.
The Trump administration announced its intention to impose travel restrictions on Cuba. As of June 5th, cruises, private yachts, and fishing vessels will not be permitted to visit the communist island. Despite the fact that Cuba is only 103 miles as the crow flies from a U.S. shore, relations have been strained since Cuban strongman Fidel Castro took power. The Cuban people largely live in a time machine with cars and such dating back to the late 1950s. And it seems that every president views our communist neighbor differently. In an effort to provide more light than heat, Liberty Nation presents this brief retrospective of Cuban-American relations, which I hope you will find informative and fascinating. Joining me now is former U.S. Ambassador to Costa Rica, Kurt Windsor. Mr. Windsor has long been considered a top U.S. expert on Central America. He has a Ph.D. in Latin American history, and he was asked by the Trump campaign to advise them in 2015. A Reagan appointee, Ambassador Windsor has traveled to Cuba and is here with us now. Welcome to Truth, Ambassador.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on.
Well, let's jump right in. From the time of the Cuban Revolution in 1959 until 1977, things were pretty frosty between the U.S. and Cuba. Then in 1977, Jimmy Carter took what's been termed as a modest diplomatic step, which permitted diplomatic communication, I believe. Then in 1980 came the messy Mariel boat lift. In March of '82, President Reagan got tough on Castro, designating Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. Geez, there's just been a long route between the U.S. and Cuba. Do you remember anything about those days, Kurt?
Pretty much. Of course, during the Cuban Missile Crisis would have been the high point of it, or low point, depending on your point of view, in terms of fear and loathing and consequence. But actually, the Cuba has been, since the Platt Amendment in 1898 or 1899, has been a major focus of the United States and Latin America, because a lot of Americans owned land in Cuba. In fact, there's quite a history, if you don't mind my rambling a bit, of American involvement in Cuba at an economic level. We owned most of the productive land in Cuba. American individuals and corporations did. And that ultimately created a certain amount of vulnerability for the United States to the developments that would occur with the rise of Castro.
Well, that's very interesting. In 1985, the U.S. fired up something called Radio Marti and began broadcasting to Cubans. But the Cubans then jammed the frequency, calling Marti propaganda. Relations between the U.S. and Cuba then got really bad, didn't they?
Well, I would say, at the risk of sounding somewhat irreverent, that Radio Marti had generally been a waste of money, because it really did not do anything to damage the Castros. I think the Castros spent more money on it than, in that sense, probably was a good thing, in that it may have taken away from their defense or offense expenditures. But the thing about Radio Marti was that it was supposed to, in effect, create discontent within Cuba. And it generally was so anodyne that it wasn't terribly good at that. It did, I'm told by my Cuban friends, I visited Cuba twice, maybe 3 times, at least twice. And my friends there told me that basically it was viewed as good entertainment. And it was not an effective tool of propaganda to speak of.
Well, before we started this interview, we talked a little bit about the name Marti. Can you tell to our viewers about what that means? They might not be aware of that.
Jose Marti was sort of the father of the Cuban Revolution. He basically was a writer he was of Cuban birth. He lived most of his life in the United States, and indeed did a lot of his work and planning for Cuba in the United States. And then, of course, he went over and became very involved in the Cuban Revolution, and was, of course, depending on who you talk to, became a martyr or was martyred, or his martyrdom, or somebody even suggests his martyrdom was arranged. But he he was killed and became, of course, the hero of first hero of modern Cuba.
Well, as we continue along our retrospective view of U.S.-Cuban relations, in 1992, 41 came along. President George H.W. Bush signed something called the Cuban Democracy Act, which basically ratcheted up the U.S. economic sanctions on Cuba. So what's your take on H.W.'s actions? And in hindsight, do you think those sanctions really worked?
No, I think they were quite vitalist. The Cubans had developed a considerable resistance to them before, whereas Cuba had been a tremendous market for Americans, and indeed playground for Americans, and indeed property ownership point for Americans prior to the revolution. Post-revolution, it was huge amounts of American property were seized. Corporations lost their subsidiaries, which were there to a very alarming extent. It all basically is built on the extent to which Cuba and the Cubans are extremely effective people within the Latin American context. They tend to be leaders, they tend to have initiative, they tend to be hardworking. Some people argue it's because of the part of Spain that their founders came from, but it's a very interesting and very complex story. But I would say Cuba, in many respects, has been one of the focal points of the United States for Latin America, largely because it was such a valuable island. So many Americans did have a stake in it, and it was so friendly.
Well, you bring up some really interesting points. Moving forward, President Clinton began 2 bilateral accords with an effort to slow the flow of refugees coming from Cuba. Kind of interesting to note now as we see what the Democratic position is. But anyway, this is back when the Democrats actually called for restrictions on immigrant flow into the U.S. So Clinton set the number of Cubans entering the U.S. to, I think it was 20,000 a year. He also began a policy called wet foot, dry foot, which meant those caught in the water were sent back to Cuba, and those on dry land were allowed to stay.
If they could get their feet on land underwater, even, they were allowed to stay. It was quite colorful in a sad way. But you have to remember that basically Cuba had become such a tyranny, economic as well as political, that people were fleeing because they could not feed their children. They could not basically feed themselves. It was not just political refugees that you were looking at. It was economic refugees and refugees of every stripe. Cuba, along with North Korea, is one of the few truly repressive regimes left. Arguably, it's Marxist, if any country has ever been Marxist. One could make even an argument that Marxism is an abstract theory that has never really been effectively engaged. But it certainly has been an effective tyranny from the point of view of Cuba's leaders, particularly, of course, since Batista.
Yeah, we could probably include China in that group as well.
Yeah, China would certainly fit in there, although it's a very different model than Cuba. And all things considered, well, I'd be hard-pressed to say which I'd rather be a citizen of. They would both be unpleasant, but in different ways. I suspect Cuba would be a bit better to that.
Coming up to the turn of the century in 1999, we got the messy Elian Gonzalez situation. My family and I were actually on the ground in Little Havana protesting the return of Elian the night before Janet Reno ordered her henchmen and an armed assault to capture the little boy. When the Supreme Court then declined to hear the case, he was returned to Cuba.
I visited Cuba twice, and I visited Cuba as a Freemason, which I'm a third-degree Mason, and was rather active with Masonic groups. And Cuba has, since Jose Marti, who was a very strong Mason, and before, a very strong tradition of Masonry, which has always undercut the tyrannies that have governed Cuba basically since, the turn of the 19th century. Masonry today is still very active in Cuba, and it was active in Cuba in the time of Fidel Castro. In fact, Fidel Castro's father was a Freemason, which is one of the reasons why they were not suppressed. That and the fact that if you tried to suppress the Masons, I think you would incur an insurrection on that island.
So you and Elian Gonzalez both visited Cuba, I guess, only he stayed. How did you find Cuba?
A fascinating country because it's a beautiful place. It's a rich country. The people have tremendous ability. I've been all over Latin America. My doctorate is in Latin American history. And I think I visited most of the countries of Latin America. But I think in terms of sheer ability and in terms of a productive and effective people, the Cubans are really on the top of the heap. They're very hard to beat, and it's not any surprise that the Russians would make good use of them for subversive purposes or for whatever purposes they wanted to use Latin Americans for.
Okay, well, now we're in the 21st century, and Castro and Venezuela's Hugo Chavez became buds, and basically the economic situation in Cuba got a bit better. But nothing really changed until 2008, didn't it, when Fidel Castro turned the country over to his brother Raul, and then President Obama held out an olive branch in, I think it was 2009, by permitting limited travel. But he did keep the trade embargo.
There was a tremendous pressure of Cubans wanting to leave Cuba because you have to remember, Cubans are natural entrepreneurs. They truly believe in private sector activity, and that being totally suppressed in Cuba, plus the lack of opportunity for their children, created an enormous incentive for people to flee. And when things became more tyrannical, that increased. But I would say there was not a dramatic increase other than maybe when things were relaxed in the United States in people fleeing Cuba. And I think, of course, at one point, Castro thought he would encourage people to flee Cuba because he wanted to get rid of his prisoners and mental institutions, which he did, by the way, infiltrating them amongst the refugees coming to the United States.
Right. But didn't Obama then travel to Cuba? In the end, did his olive branches really help things, Mr. Ambassador?
Certainly not. I think it probably, if anything, encouraged the government of Cuba to take advantage of the United States, which they have, the government of Cuba, as opposed to the Cuban people, has always viewed the United States with great contempt.
Well, moving forward, in June of 2017, President Trump reinstated limited travel to Cuba, but did not lift the economic sanctions. Now he's rescinded that and taken away the travel. And basically we have the travel restrictions in place. In your educated opinion, what, if anything, do you think will work with Cuba in the days ahead as we have looked at what hasn't worked thus far?
Well, short of an outright invasion or a military action, given the effectiveness of the tyranny in Cuba, there, I believe, is relatively little we could do. Using propaganda, using indirect methods will not be an effective tool against the Fidel Castro regime. It can make life more unpleasant for them, make life more difficult for them. But as in the case of most communist tyrannies and people that hate the United States, the elites just pass this discomfort through to their own people. They're not at all affected by it. The problem goes to, in effect, the victimization of the Cuban people or the people who are in the countries that are so treated. I think it would be very, very complicated, given the depth of the tyranny in that country, to do anything short of without a military component that would be effective.
All right, you've made some excellent points. Thank you for joining us on Liberty Nation's retrospective on Cuban-American relations. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. I hope it helps.
That's former U.S. Ambassador to Costa Rica and Central American expert Curtin Windsor.
Truth is making a comeback. Visit us at libertynation.com.